Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News. Today it is December 18th, 2024, Wednesday. December 18th, 2024. This is when we start seeing all the shows about what happened in this past year. And there's a lot of interest. Yes, this is when we have a we look back on what happened during 2024. Very unusual, to say the least. But since unusual is part of Eerie News, we're off to our first story. And this is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled A Thousand Years Worth of Sacrifices. The Mayans, which lived in the area of Lake Peten Itza in Guatemala, have been known to make animal and human sacrifices. But a recent discovery by Polish divers and researchers indicate that blood sacrifices were made for close to 1,000 years, especially when they faced war with their Spanish conquerors in 1697. The Mayan civilization extended across modern southeast Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Peten Itza was the last bastion of the Maya until it fell to the conquistadors in the 1690s. Lake Peten Itza surrounded an island called Flores that was once the site of the Maya city of Nochpeten. It was linked by a causeway to the shore. Historians have documented in the early 1620s a Spanish party received permission to visit Nochpeten. They were led by Friar Diego Delgado, who was accompanied by 13 Spanish soldiers and 80 Mayan guides from Tipu, which was Belize, or later became Belize, who had converted to Christianity. The party was seized when they arrived at Nochpeten and sacrificed with their hearts cut out. They were then decapitated and their heads displayed on stakes around the city. Delgado was dismembered. It's believed that some of the sacrifices were done prior to many of the battles with their enemies, especially the conquistadors who leveled the city with the use of cannons. Nochpeten was the last city to be conquered by the Spanish in all of Mesoamerica. Hundreds of artifacts have been recovered beneath the waters of the lake, including an obsidian dagger that could have been the killing instrument used to dispatch the sacrificial victims. The Maya often used these instruments to cut the hearts out of living victims in a way very reminiscent of the Aztecs. According to Magdalena Kresmian of Poland's Jagiellonian University, quote, water had very special and symbolic meaning in ancient Maya beliefs. It was thought to be the door to the underworld, the world of death, Ixbalba, where their gods lived. Evidence of offerings, including animal and human sacrifice, have been found in lakes and in flooded limestone sinkholes known as cenotes, which are common in the region. The researchers believe the Itzamaya group lowered the artifacts into the lake as an offering to their god, which is why they were so well preserved. The ceremonial relics from the lake bed are pre-Columbian, dating from 150 BC up to 800 AD. The divers found grisly skull-shaped incense burners, shells, and ceremonial bowls. It is believed the shells that were found were imported from the Caribbean. Another god which the Mayan made human sacrifice to was one of their most ancient ones, named Chak, which controlled rain, lightning, and storms. For a culture that was rain-dependent for their agriculture, a drought was greatly feared. Chak is portrayed as a blend of human and animal characteristics. He has reptilian attributes and fish scales, a long curly nose, and a protruding lower lip. He holds the stone axe used to produce lightning and wears an elaborate headdress. Ceremonies to Chak were held in each Maya city, and rituals were held in the fields and public settings such as plazas. Sacrifices of young boys and girls were carried out in especially dramatic periods such as after a prolonged period of drought. In 1967, an underground body of water known as a chultung or cenote was discovered at Chichen Itza. In the sacrificial cenote, people were thrown and left to drown there, accompanied by precious offerings of gold and jade, as well as animal bones, ceramic, and clay objects. In 2008, archaeologists found the Mayans were likely sacrificing young boys and not virginal girls as previously believed. They were thrown alive to drown or ritually skinned or dismembered before being offered to appease the deity Chak. The exact location of the Chak mule discovered by Auguste Leplanjon in 1875 has never been ascertained, Many think he found it buried in what later became known as the platform of the Eagles and Jaguars, or the Venus platform. Both of these areas are between the ball court and El Castillo El Chichen Itza. In 1875, the site was different. Piles of rubbish dotted the landscape of the ruins. Le Plongeon said he had deciphered murals and hieroglyphics, which led him to the Chark Mule mound, but he never gave more information than this. Le Plongeon's discovery might have been the first, but it was by no means the last. In total, 14 chalk mules have been found at Chichen Itza, 12 at Ula, and others scattered through Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. However, none of them predate the one found by Le Plongeon. Archaeologist Guillermo de Anda from the University of Yucatan pieced together the bones of 127 bodies discovered at the bottom of one of Chichen Itza's sacred caves. Over 80% were likely boys between the ages of 3 and 11. It's suspected that these children were stolen from surrounding settlements to be used as sacrifices. According to de Anda, it was thought that the gods preferred small things, and especially the rain god, who had 4 helpers that were represented as tiny people, so the children were offered as a way to directly communicate with Chak. Despite their prayers and in some cases blood offerings, it appears that the Mayan gods were not appeased. Eventually, the culture was decimated and the cities were abandoned to be reclaimed by the jungle. And the thing of the Chak Mule is that, as you can see right there for those of you watching the video, there are several that they think that the Chak Mule was like the offering place where they would put like the hearts or anything like that. This was like because they're found all over the place. The sacrifice, whatever they had to give over, was placed here on the Chak Mule's belly. Interesting. Very interesting. Very bloody, but very interesting. Okay, next story is titled Old-Fashioned Hitchhiking Ghost Stories. Why not? Many people are familiar with urban myths involving phantom hitchhikers. One of the most famous in the United States is Chicago's Resurrection Mary. However, hitchhiking ghosts have been around for a very long time and have been scaring Good Samaritans for years, including when the mode of transportation was horseback. If you compare these stories to more modern and popularized ones, all you have to do is replace the horse or buggy for a vehicle. Not all of the hitchhikers were trying to make it home. Others seem to have an otherworldly cast of doom. There is no doubt that phantom hitchhikers have been with us for a very long time. The following are a few of those stories. The following was retold by Agnes Sullivan, age 50, American-born of Irish family. This was 1943. Quote, one day a few years ago, a woman was leaving one of the Catholic churches in Albany. On the doorstep, she met a friend, and in the course of their conversation, the woman happened to mention that she had been praying for employment for some time, and that as yet her prayers had gone unanswered. Her friend persuaded her to come back into the church with her, and as they were leaving the church a few minutes later, they met a young man who asked if either one of them was seeking employment. The woman replied that she was seeking employment as a housekeeper or as a companion. Then the young man gave her a card containing the name and address of an elderly woman who he said was badly in need of such a person. The next day the woman called at the address given to her. The old lady said that she was in need of a companion, but since she had told no one of it, she wondered how the woman had found out. The applicant told her that a young man had given her the address, and then seeing his picture on the wall, she pointed to him and said that it was he who had given her the information. The old lady said, why, that is impossible, because this is a picture of my son, and he's been dead for more than 6 months. As you can tell, this is very similar to the hitchhiking stories of where the confirmation is made by a picture of the ghost. End quote. Next story, retold by Frank Smith, age 48, an electrician of Polish descent. Again, this is from 1943. Quote, a man that I know, a professional man in town who does not want to be quoted because he thought it would reflect on his professional standing, once told me this story. He told me that when he was in school in northern Italy, he and a friend of his went out to a dance in the neighboring village. On the way out, they hitchhiked with a farmer, but within a few miles of their destination, the farmer turned to go on a different road and left him standing in the road. Then they noticed a young lad sitting on a milestone. He called them and asked them if they would do him a favor. He first asked them where they had come from the village. They said yes. He said, will you take this message to my parents? He gave them the address and they promised they would after the dance. and then they went on their way to the dance. For some reason or other, they looked around. After taking a few steps, the stranger was nowhere to be found. They went to the dance, stayed fairly late until they were ready to go home. On their way home, they reminded each other of the promise to deliver the message. They thought it was late, but finally decided to deliver the message anyway. They came to the house, rapped at the door, and an elderly woman came to the door. They inquired whether so-and-so lived there, and she said yes, that was her name. Then they said they had a message from her son. She immediately left the door and went into the house, and the husband came out and lectured the boys, saying they shouldn't have done what they did. They were perplexed, for they had seen nothing wrong in what they had done. Then they delivered the message. The father found what he had been looking for in a drawer. He showed them a group photograph and asked them to see if they could recognize who had given them the message. They immediately recognized the lad who had given them the message on the road. Then the father confessed that this was his son who had been killed 6 months before at that spot. End quote. Next story, retold by Mr. and Mrs. Paul Der Ohansian, Sr. of Armenian stock. They knew the story in their birthplace, Marak, Turkey. Quote, a young man riding home on horseback was delayed, so he had to travel at night. He was quite a distance from the town when he was about to pass a cemetery. A little perturbed and frightened, he noticed a woman sitting beside the road crying. He stopped his horse and asked her what was the trouble. She told him she must get to town, but she was so tired and weak she could not. He willingly assisted her on the horse. Riding along, he held her at the same time so she wouldn't fall off. Galloping along toward home, he noticed she was becoming heavier and harder to hold on the horse. She never spoke a word. He finally arrived at the town at dawn, thoroughly frightened and worried. He dismounted and was about to help the lady down when he discovered she was a corpse. Early risers told the frightened man not to worry, as she does this on the anniversary of her burial every year since she died. Her relatives take the corpse back and rebury it. End quote. Next story, retold by Grace C. Martin, who lived as a girl in and near Del Mar, a small town 8 miles southwest of Albany, New York. The story was current in the 1890s. Quote, she told of tales that she had heard of a ghost rider who used to jump on young men's horses as they went past a certain wood near Del Mar on their way to parties. The rider woman always disappeared when they arrived at their destination. She was believed to have been a jealous one, but did little harm except riding behind the young men. End quote. Next story, retold by Elmer Hockle of Fort Hunter, 65 years old, a broom maker who heard it from his father about 1882 as having happened in Fort Hunter about 1820. Quote, Mr. Hockle was returning to his home one night in a lumber wagon, driving a team of horses, when he saw a man walking in the same direction. He stopped and asked if he wanted a ride. The man climbed in without saying anything, and Mr. Hockle drove on. He tried to talk to him, but the man said nothing. Mr. Hockle later said that as he caught a glimpse of his face, it looked peculiar in color. After driving a considerable distance, he turned to speak to him, and the man had disappeared. He stopped the team and got out to see if the man had fallen out, but he could find nothing. He never understood or was able to explain who or what the man represented. End quote. Next story, retold by James Rowe of Morris, New York, circa late 19th century. The rain was coming down hard, and I feared that Grandfather Rowe would start any minute for the barn, but it seemed he was merely rummaging through his mind for another story. He spat reflectively and continued, that's all I've ever seen myself, but I recollect Grandma Anthony telling about a teamster who used to drive this road back in the days, when they did a big business hauling freight. The teamster was a great big man, afraid of neither man nor the devil. Night or day made no difference to him. Well, one dark rainy night, he was hauling freight down the line, when out of the darkness a man climbed on the wagon seat right beside him. Never said a word, just climbed on and sat down. The teamster looked him over, undecided whether to kick him off or not. He couldn't see much because the fellow had his collar turned up and his cap pulled down low. The teamster didn't know just what to make of it, so they rode along a mile or two. Neither one said a thing. Then all at once the man pitched sideward off the wagon onto the road. The teamster pulled up and looked for the fellow, but it was so tarnation black he couldn't see anything, so he yelled for a lantern at a farmhouse up the road, and he and the farmer searched for the stranger. but he had disappeared. There wasn't a trace of him. Nobody would have thought much about it, but a couple of trips later they found the teamster lying in the road with a broken neck. He had fallen off the wagon at the exact spot where he claimed the man had disappeared into the darkness. End quote. This next story retold by Mrs. Henry G. Rebar, as told to her by her mother, who lived in Belfort. It is in the Black River Valley country in the western foothills of the Adirondacks. Quote, Clarence Holman, who worked in the Belfort tannery in the late 90s, one winter night he hired a team and cutter to go to a show at the Krogan Opera House 4 miles away. On his way home, just at midnight, he saw a heavily cloaked figure standing in the wheel track by the cemetery on the outskirts of town. He was forced to drop or run over the man. He stopped, threw back the buffalo robe and called, "Do you want a ride?" The man did not answer, but face averted climbed into the sleigh. Clarence made a few perfunctory remarks but received no answer. The winter night was cold but dry. Now, however, the air seemed pervaded with a clammy chill. The buffalo robe lay flat upon the seat, and Clarence had the feeling that there was no one beside him. Still, he could see the unmistakable outlines of the man's figure. The horses were snorting and sniffing. Horses can always scent ghosts or witches, and were only too eager to run when Clarence gave them their heads. Finally, they reached his boarding house at Belfort. He stopped the horses, threw back the robe, stammered, "Well, this is as far as I go." While saying a word or turning his head, the man started to get out. But there against the white snow in the bright moonlight was nothing. End quote. Next story, retold by Charles Van Buren, an elderly native of Albany, New York, who heard the story as a boy. Quote, Red always walked home from work. Every night about the same time he was overtaken by a man driving along in an old-fashioned top buggy. They always spoke and went on their way. One night it began to rain hard, and this time when the man came along he offered Red a ride. Since they had a speaking acquaintance, and since it was raining so hard, Red was glad to get the ride. He got in and felt he should make some sort of conversation, but he didn't get any answer. He noticed that the man's face was hidden by a high collar, and he didn't turn his face to Red at first. When he finally did turn his face, he stared at Red as if he were trying to stare through him. His eyes were bright green like a cat's, and his skin was white like a dead person. Red was surprised and said, "Do you feel sick? You are so pale." So the man stared at him while his face changed to a pale glow. Then he disappeared. The horse started running faster and faster while Red, frightened by the man's disappearance, tried to stop him. Red finally stopped the horse and got out of the buggy. The second he did so, the man appeared in the seat again and drove away fast. So you see, that Good Samaritan giving somebody a ride has been around for a while. Even before, even before the advent of the automobile. A lot of people think that hitchhiking ghost stuff. There you go. Next story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories is titled A Hint of a Secret Past. In a scene that's enacted hundreds of times, a family member cleans out a deceased one's estate, only to come across the unexpected and the hint of a secret past. Such was the case in June 2011 when the Park County, Wyoming Sheriff's Office made a media release that a skull was found in a rural home. The deceased person supposedly got the skull in a trade under the assumption it came from a World War II concentration camp. The skull was missing its lower jawbone and had a penetrating injury to the left temple area. Dr. Weatherman from the University of Wyoming Anthropology Department Human Remains Repository, after an examination, determined it belonged to a male over the age of 60 who probably came from the area of Romania, Hungary, or Turkey in Eastern Europe. The question remains, why would anyone want a skull of a man that was killed, possibly in a concentration camp? The person who could have supplied the answer took it to the grave. In 1992, Newell Sessions, a resident of Thermopolis, Wyoming, decided to open a padlocked military footlocker that dated back to the 1930s. It had been in this shed since 1987. Sessions had acquired this shed from an acquaintance named John Morris in 1986, and Morris moved away. He left everything inside behind as well. Whether Sessions was a busy man or just not the curious type, it had sat on his property for 5 years. Using a torch, he removed the lock and found the unexpected. It was a human skeleton wrapped in plastic, a belt, and rotted grocery bag. The skeleton was missing the feet and lower legs. When authorities examined the remains, it was found the person had been shot in the chest and in the skull, where the bullet was still lodged. It was obvious it was a murder. Later turned out the man had been shot through the eye. The rotted bag was from a Hy-Vee, which pointed to an Iowan source, possibly as far back as the 1950s. The 25 caliber bullet found in the skull began in 1908. The trunk and lock were likely made in the 1930s. Neil Sessions died in 2003, and it wasn't until 24 years after his discovery that the victim was given a name. He was Joseph Mulvaney, a veteran and railroad worker who disappeared in 1963. Mulvaney was born on January 3, 1921, in Maton, Illinois. He joined the National Guard in 1941 and served in the 130th Infantry 33rd Division. His service during World War II took him to Australia and the Philippines. After the war, he worked for railroad companies and eventually moved to California, where he met Mary Alice McLeese, who had served herself in the military during World War II. The couple had 3 children of their own. However, Mary had a son from a previous relationship named John David Morris, the very person who had given the shed to Sessions. The Mulvaneys, with their 3 children, moved to Des Moines, Iowa in 1963. Shortly after the couple signed the paperwork on the sale of the house, Joseph Mulvaney disappeared and strangely was never reported missing. He was an only child, and his parents and grandparents were deceased. There was no one left from his family of origin to ask about his whereabouts. Surprisingly, Sessions was just going to bury the bones, but his wife Daisy told him he should call police. Based on information provided by Sessions, authorities tracked down John Morris, who in 1992 lived in Arlington, Texas. John Lumley, then sheriff for Hot Springs County, interrogated Morris over the phone, and he said of the conversation, he said he'd bought it in either Oklahoma or Iowa. He didn't remember where. He had moved from town to town, state to state, and never opened it. He just kept it. Lumley traveled to Texas to question Morris further and said, I got into his face about it a little bit. He related the same information and terminated the conversation. He invoked his rights under Miranda, and we ceased talking. In an interview with a newspaper reporter, Morris gave a similar story, saying he bought it at a yard sale in Des Moines or Iowa Falls around the mid-1970s. This, of course, was prior to the discovery of the bones inside. Why he would have bought a footlocker and never opened it was never explained. Good question, right? I would have opened that thing right away. The strange case was aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1993. It was titled Gabby's Bones. John Morris, identified as Gabby in the episode, did not participate in the recreations, but did sit down for an interview with his face obscured. During the show, Lumley said he believed Morris knew more about the identity of the murdered man than he let on. Lumley was closer to the truth than he could have imagined, since authorities did not know the remains belonged to his stepfather. He was 16 years old when Mulvaney disappeared. During the episode, a reconstruction of the victim was aired. Eventually, it would lead to a vital clue in solving the mystery. One of the persons who saw the episode was Shelley Statler, Mulvaney's granddaughter. Later, she would say the jawline on the reconstruction was extremely similar to many people in her family. This, plus the fact she was related to John Morris, the original owner of the trunk. After viewing the Unsolved Mysteries episode, Shelley Statler and her mother, Kathy, Joseph's oldest daughter, contacted law enforcement in Thermopolis. It wasn't until 2017 that DNA from the bones to Kathy were compared with a 99% match. It turned out that not knowing what happened to Joseph Mulvaney had put a great strain on the family. Mary Mulvaney told her children their father had left voluntarily. Statler would go on to explain that her family believed Mary Alice Mulvaney shot her husband in April 1963. Morris was 16 then and reported as a nephew and not a stepson to Joseph Mulvaney. Buried the body in her grandmother's backyard. Sheriff Lumley believes Morris exhumed the skeleton, placed it in the trunk, and took it with him when he moved to Wyoming. He explained the plastic Hy-Vee bag inside the trunk demonstrated the body was disinterred since only paper bags were used when Mulvaney disappeared, which was, let me tell you something very interesting, because when he disappeared in 63, this was previous to plastic bags at supermarkets, and There was a plastic bag in there showed that they had been disinterred. I thought that was very interesting. Now let's continue. Statler said, I don't think my grandparents had a very good marriage, and I know it affected my mom and her siblings growing up. My grandmother wasn't always easy to get along with. I do believe John Morris knew more than he is saying, but I don't believe he pulled the trigger. In 2019, Morris, then in his 70s, was contacted by a reporter, but he refused to comment on the story. Mary Mulvaney died in 2009, and by then she had moved to Florida and lost touch with her family for 10 years. All three of her children passed away by 2022. In 1977, a human skull, there's another story, was found in Teton County, Wyoming, and after 21 years of having gone missing, was identified as belonging to Dwayne Beckstrom, 23, who disappeared on October 26, 1956. Dentists used Army records to give him a name. The skull had a bullet hole in the right temple from a .38 caliber bullet. Beckstrom was a sergeant in the Marines and had served in the Korean War. He made his home in South Dakota and after 6 days failed to return home. His car was found abandoned 4 miles from the skull. One would assume he died by his own hand, but did he? The war had ended 3 years before, and he left behind his parents and 4 siblings. Even young lives have secrets. In 1960, a human skull was found in the furnace of a liquor store in New Britain, Connecticut. The police dug into the history of the building and discovered a medical student once lived there. The one-time student was located, only now he was a doctor. He told authorities he had brought it home from medical school and misplaced it. But of all the places to misplace a skull, why a furnace? So police had no choice but to accept the doctor's word that the skull was an anatomical specimen, since there was no one there to say differently. In 1934, 2 boys found a skull inside a large can on a dump near William Land in Sacramento. They were walking home from a fishing trip and were kicking cans when they found one which was heavier than the others. The skull was taken home and played with by children in the neighborhood for 2 days until the parents called the police. 3 years before, a man's dismembered body was found close to where the skull was discovered. The coroner said the skull was that of a mature man and the lower jaw was missing and only a few of the teeth were left in the upper mandible. A detective believed the skull was at least 75 to 100 years old and had nothing to do with what had been dubbed as the torso murder by the press. The heinous crime came to light on August 19, 1931, when a rag picker found the body of a white man whose hands indicated he was not a laborer. The body was severed at the neck and the upper part of the thighs. 4 days after the torso was discovered, the thighs were found at the dump, and a week later, police found the rest of the legs. The one thing that was not found was the head, and thus the body remained unidentified. 9 months before the skull was discovered, Gilbert Francis Cawley, known as Gorilla Man, escaped from the Mendocino State Hospital for the criminally insane. He was captured a few hours later. He was committed in 1932 after having been found insane while awaiting execution at San Quentin for the murder of Dale Slater, age 20. When captured, he had a number of hacksaw blades sewn in his clothing. He confessed to murdering and burning the shack of George Walker and assuming his identity. Cawley was also suspected in the torso murder north of Sacramento in the fall of 1930 and at least 2 other killings. Cawley tried to commit suicide after being sent to San Quentin. 15 years after the discovery of the torso murder, a new hint was promised. Sheriff Don Cox went to look at old pictures taken of the crime scene. The pictures were of 2 quilts found with a dismembered body. The quilts were later destroyed along with some old files in the basement of the district attorney's office. Southern California police believe the body may have been that of Wade B. Hampton, who disappeared in Long Beach about the time of the discovery in 1931. A Long Beach woman in whose house Hampton roomed said she last saw him leave with Gilbert F. Cawley, who then was 67 years old, and serving 2 life sentences for murder in Folsom Prison. Cox was going to question the woman if the quilts in the picture were the same ones she said she made herself, and which Cawley had in his possession when he left her house with Hampton. Until then, Cawley denied all knowledge of Hampton's disappearance. Strangely, there was a Wade B. Hampton who died in March 1931 of pneumonia who lived in Long Beach. There was nothing mysterious about his death. He was 66 years old, a laborer, married, and with several adult children. Nothing came of Cox's visit, or at least nothing was published. The police never released any information as to the motive why Colley would have killed Hampton, and nothing more was mentioned after the story ran in 1946. Did the prosecutor decide that since Colley was already serving 2 life sentences, nothing more could come of it, or was the story about Hampton a ruse to cover some other angle to the murder? What became of Gilbert Colley is unknown beyond the fact that he was still behind bars in 1946. The native Texan was married twice and had children. Whether he died in prison or was ever paroled was never recorded. This would not be the last time Sheriff Cox was involved in a torso murder. In 1949, he arrested Victoriano Corrales, who confessed to throwing the mutilated body of Maria Pulido, who he brought to the U.S. from Mexico, into the American River near Sacramento. His spot was near to his cabin where at different times he lived with 2 girls who he admitted he killed and dismembered, and disposed of their bodies by throwing them in the river. He regularly beat his wife Angelina, the mother of his 6 children, and threatened to kill her. In 1948, Corrales was executed at San Quentin prison. Sheriff Cox retired in 1960, and the identity of the dismembered man remained a mystery, as well as whose skull was in the can found by the boys. And that's the thing, after all, I think the torso murder, supposedly, never solved more, is whose head was in that can that the kids were kicking around and playing around before. I had to laugh at that point. Before the parents said, "Hey, we need to call the police on that. There's a skull." And like, of all the things, why would anybody put a skull in a can? All right, next story is out of Daily Mail. It's titled, "I'm an exorcist. These chilling cases are how I know the devil is real." A Catholic priest says he knows the devil is real because he has come face to face with the demon himself. Father Carlos Martins has performed many exorcisms during his 20 years of ministry, cleansing people taunted by voices, blackouts, and vanishing wounds. Exorcists are often asked whether demonic behavior depicted in the famous 1973 film The Exorcist is accurate, said Father Martins. Except for one phenomena, the 360-degree head turn by the possessed, everything in the movie depicts what a possessed person might do. The horrors of demon possession that he has witnessed over the past 2 decades included levitation, dramatic changes in facial features, and an aversion to God. Father Martins described an exorcism he performed on a middle-aged woman, and when it was about to begin, she locked arms with a man whose job it was to restrain her and threw him over her head as if he were a rag doll. The man was over 6 feet tall and weighed more than 300 pounds. Doing a complete flip in the air, he landed on the floor 10 feet in front of her. The woman then pointed her finger at the nearest light switch on the wall, about 12 feet away. One of the screws holding the switch's cover plate unscrewed itself and darted into her open right hand through the air. She drove it into her left forearm. Later in the same session, she struck me in the face with such force that I needed 2 surgeries to repair the damage I sustained to my skull. All right. While Father Martin claims to have performed many exorcisms, scientists have suggested that such individuals are only posed by psychological disorders. Some patients who were considered affected by demons and treated with neuroleptics subsequently experienced remission, suggesting strong support for a biochemical theory. Dr. Amin Mohammed Gaddit, professor of psychiatry at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Canada, said, "There may also be a possible explanatory role related to abnormal functioning of brainstem structures in the region of the 4th ventricle, whether caused by genetic or environmental factors or a combination thereof." Other research has suggested the possession syndrome was a result of psychological factors like severe mental illness, trauma, mass hysteria, or cultural beliefs. But these suggestions have not stopped Father Martins from his fight against evil. In his new book, The Exorcist Files, 2 stories about the reality of evil and how to defeat it, Father Martins reveals some of the chilling cases he has personally encountered which show the reality of the devil and his minions. "People ask me what it is like to battle the devil. My opponent is hatred himself," reads the book. "When I walk into a room to conduct an exorcism, the contempt and disdain of the ancient serpent, the one who refused to obey God, the one who caused our first parents to fall, the one who delights in every human misfortune and suffering, meets me head on." The childless woman. One of Father Martin's most harrowing encounters came from young couple Cheryl and Mark. All the names in his books have been changed for privacy. The couple failed to get pregnant, causing Cheryl to become depressed and fill the void with an obsession with baby clothes, diapers, infant toys, and a crib. But things took a turn for the worse when she started collecting dead insects, including crickets, grasshoppers, hornets, moths, and butterflies, and putting them next to the empty crib. Someone told me they would help me get pregnant, Cheryl told Mar, Father Martins, I guess. When they die, their spirit hangs around their bodies looking for a place to form new life. Death releases life energy. I wanted the energy to make a baby happen inside my womb. The cribs then began to be filled with dead squirrels and birds, increasing Mark's worries about his wife, who had also paid thousands of dollars to a psychic who told her to use the dead animal's life energy to become pregnant. Finally, Mark followed Cheryl to a pet store and came home to a scene of unimaginable horror. Cheryl stood over several dead rats, one still twitching, and when Mark confronted her, she said in an extremely deep alien voice, "You keep the F away from the rats." Mark sought help from his Methodist minister and said, "You need to go to the Catholics for help with this. They're the only ones with a handle on this kind of thing." Father Martins arrived at their home to speak with Cheryl, who turned and said, "Why did you bring this bastard priest here?" "Who are you?" Father Martins asked. "You know who the F I am," Cheryl replied. After 8 exorcism sessions, she was cleansed. Father Martins wrote, "In the end, it took the pain, humiliation, and powerlessness of demonic possession to convince Cheryl to look to God rather than motherhood for meaning." The possessed firefighter. Jeremy, a firefighter in his late 20s, went to Father Martin's church seeking help for his bizarre behavior, days-long blackouts, and unexplained injuries. When he introduced himself, I found Jeremy polite, soft-spoken, and gracious, the epitome of a gentleman. Father Martin shared in his book, by his demeanor, no one would guess anything was wrong with him. Due to the first impression, Father Martins had to perform the Catholic Church's rite of exorcism to be sure the young man was indeed possessed. The rite of exorcism involves a variety of prayers, including the Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, and the Athanasian Creed, with a priest using holy water and a cross. The ritual requires a moral certainty that an individual is possessed before an exorcist may perform it, the book reads. Moral certainty is understood as a conclusion any intelligent and rational person would reach given the evidence gathered. Father Martins and Jeremy spoke privately for a moment, discussing the firefighters' experiences that occurred before the strangeness set in, and that is when the source of the possession was revealed. Jeremy recalled when he was 8 years old and his brother's friend brought in a Ouija board to the house and invited him to participate. He remembered the planchette moving in response to various questions the group posed, and that night, Jeremy went to bed and saw a dark figure in his room. The figure was so black that although the lights were off, everything else in the room looked like it was in broad daylight. Besides being intensely black, the only additional detail recalled was that it had a human body, but a cat's head, Father Martin said. Jeremy said the figure promised to give him anything he wanted in return for his soul, and as a young boy he dreamed of becoming a firefighter. Father Martins handed Jeremy a book with a small drop of holy water on the cover, and when he grabbed it, he shot up out of the chair and arched his upper body backward. "Demon, who are you?" I asked. "F you, priest," he responded. "He is mine. He gave himself to me. You will never have him." "Demon, I want to speak to Jeremy," I said. He responded with a slow mocking laughter. "In the name of Jesus, I command you to bring forth Jeremy," I declared. Father ministers repeatedly told Jeremy he needed to renounce the demon, and claim Jesus as your Lord. Jeremy forced the words out, banishing the demon from his body, Father Martins claimed. The next one, the haunted music box. One of Father Martin's first encounters with the devil occurred while he was deployed to Afghanistan to teach the gospel. He encountered the devil's supernatural powers head-on when he helped a woman whose house had been destroyed by fire, so she had moved into her uncle's house. Before long, she began hearing voices calling her from adjacent rooms and scratching noises inside the walls, Father Martin said. Appliances turned on and off by themselves, and an object sitting safely on a table or countertop would suddenly drop to the floor. The phenomena terrified her. Although demonic possession were fairly new to him, he had a strong sense of being watched by something that did not want him to be there. Even the air felt like it was against me. I was being warned, "Get out or else." Then the woman shouted, "That's the music box," said Father Martins. She had previously mentioned the music box that chimed randomly from her uncle's room, even with the winding key removed. Father Martins blessed every room with holy water, but discovered something shocking inside the music box. I reached down and picked it up without any trouble, and as soon as my hands touched it, it stopped chiming, he said. I opened the lid to look inside. To our mutual shock, the music box held nothing There were no parts, no chimes, no wind-up mechanism, and no place for batteries. After I sprinkled the box with holy water, she never experienced diabolical phenomena again, and lived peacefully within her uncle's home. Father Martins noted that he would have been content as a priest without meeting a single demon, saying, "Though it is a joy to do this work, I've never enjoyed meeting the devil and his minions." Let me tell you, that first story of this lady can't have babies. This is the thing. Before an exorcism is carried out, they do make sure to have this person tested for mental illness, because it's true. Many of these cases of possession really in reality are problems with schizophrenia. They're psychotic. In other words, they're people that are deeply disturbed. Sometimes they're undiagnosed, sometimes they're diagnosed, but they don't take their meds. But I can imagine, I'm sorry, this is just me putting my two. I'm sure that guy, after everything was said and done, was like, man, I'm glad I didn't have a baby with you. See, that's disturbing behavior. It'd be like insects killing animals. I don't know about that. It's like, woo, that gene pool should not reproduce. So anyway, here we are at the end of another set of eerie news. And as we trudge along into the new year, I will be back, most certainly with a lot of weird stuff. And until next time, take care.